The sun over Enfidaville shone like old brass, and the wind drove grit into our teeth. I set my Modelo 91/38 Carcano on the stones, empty magazine, bolt stiff with dust, and raised my hands with the rest of the battery. The last guns thudded twice and went quiet, like stubborn men finally persuaded. It was May 13th, 1943. General Giovanni Messe had signaled the inevitable, and British lorries already snaked across the flats. A sunburned corporal passed cigarettes to men who lacked the breath to thank him. Another tossed a chocolate bar and said we looked like ghosts. He wasn't wrong. We had rationed everything: powder, shells, water, hope. My boots had the soft give of paper. Stretcher bearers nodded to our wounded as if to old comrades. Fear never arrived. The last barrage had drained it with our last shells. They formed us into columns, took our watches, counted us like freight, and waved us toward the coast. Lee Enfield rifles glinted over our shoulders. I tried not to think about the Carcano's ritual, lift, draw, push, that felt suddenly antique. At intersections, new accents and uniforms cropped up: British red tabs, American khaki, a French kepi. The war that swallowed us was larger than any doctrine we had memorized. Our lorry rattled through orchards where torn canvas hung like pennants. Parks of trucks stretched until counting them felt like counting seconds in a fever. I had believed in clever lines, Kasserine, Meredith, as if geography could save an army, but fuel cans were stacked like bricks, and signal wire ran in tidy swags. Supply, not creed, had won the argument. At the port, the sea dazzled. Ships crowded the water, gray freighters, a white hospital ship, destroyers with numbers like street addresses. A British corporal said many of us would go beyond the U-boats to America itself. The word rose and fell like a gull. I had imagined factory smoke and a jazz radio, but not that America would be the war's deep ocean where cargo disappeared into abundance and returned multiplied. Near the gate, new sentries relieved the post. Americans with a different ease, weight settled on their heels. Their rifles caught my eye. The actions did not lift and chase. Bolts did not hop back and forth. A young guard showed another how an 8-round clip slid into the breech and locked. One tug and the rifle was ready. M1 Garand, someone said. .30-06, semi-automatic, an en-bloc clip that pinged free. The demonstration lasted seconds, but measured a century. We climbed a gangway that quivered underfoot. The ship's plates were welded in long, neat seams, rather than peppered with rivets. Liberty ship, a sailor said. 10,000 tons of cargo, 441 feet long, a triple expansion engine beating below like a patient heart. The crew moved with the crisp fatigue of people who worked hard and never starved. A boatswain bragged that a yard in the States had launched one in 4 days and a few hours. He wasn't joking. Below decks, we received blankets and a stew that tasted of salt and mercy. Talk went on in the dimness. Someone claimed American factories were turning out rifles by the million, trucks by the hundreds of thousands, tanks by a fleet. The rumor rang true. The hull thrummed and the air smelled of oil and hot metal. Above us, destroyers and corvettes took station. Our convoy slid into the Atlantic like a train, leaving a blacked-out city. The escort's Aldous lamps winked brief messages we could not read, and somewhere forward a bosun's pipe lifted a thin, ceremonial note. I lay awake counting the strokes of the engine and tried, uselessly, to imagine the factory that had cast its heart. That night I could not sleep. Every creak and shudder carried an argument I could not dismiss. If a nation could build a ship faster than a man could recite the tale, what chance did a gun pit on a Tunisian ridge have? I turned the Carcano's oiled bolt and knew it for a keepsake from another era. The war would continue without me, measured now in shipyard hours and factory shifts, and somewhere beyond the horizon lay the country that made it so. Gray water heaved to the horizon, and the Liberty ship shouldered through it with workmanlike patience. Days arranged themselves by the watch. 4 hours on hatch gangs, 4 below, 4 drifting in half-sleep while the engine beat time. The mess served coffee that tasted burnt and magnificent. A Navy signalman on the bridge wing showed me his blinker and grinned when I mimicked letters. He said the real enemy, out here, was boredom. I learned the ship in layers. The triple expansion engine breathed like a giant asleep. The shaft tunneled aft behind hatches we were told never to touch. Winches complained when the guards drilled us, steel teeth skittering across steel drums. Salt caked the rails white. At night, blackout shades starved the passageways of light, but the smell of oil guided you like a rope. Once the deck crew dumped spoiled tins, peaches, I think, over the side. The sweet smell floated back on our wake, indecently rich. Rumor migrated from hold to hold. One guard, an easygoing Midwesterner who called me Johnny, said a yard at Richmond, California had launched a Liberty ship in 4 days and 15.5 hours. He told it without a wink. I had only the memory of our workshops at Foggia, where a gearbox waited weeks for a bearing and a squad waited months for boots. If the story was true, the Americans were counting time differently from the rest of us. On calmer days, we were marched around the deck for exercise. An American lieutenant, tidy and polite, asked what gun I had served. 75 Modello 06, I said. He nodded and said his brother loaded shells for a 105 in Tunisia and that the art now was keeping barrels fed faster than they could be worn out. Logistics, not bravado, was killing us. The convoy altered course without ceremony. One morning the Atlantic smell changed, more river in it, less ocean, and gulls began to shadow us. The skyline rose out of fog like a ship built of stone. Boston, the guard said. Harbor buoys rang little bronze notes. Tugs nosed us into a forest of cranes. On the piers, pallets stood in murals, ration crates, fuel drums, tar paper rolls, lines of truck tires big as fonts. Order lived here. Forklifts wove through chalked lanes. Civilian stevedores worked beside Army personnel with white tapes on their sleeves. From a warehouse came the high clack of typewriters, an artillery of forms. A gang of soldiers dismounted a field kitchen with rehearsed grace. Dock, yard, rail, habit in everything. A sergeant in a brimmed campaign hat called the roll and sorted us by language. An American woman in uniform, tan shirt, skirt, garrison cap, stepped forward with a clipboard. Women's Army Corps, someone whispered. She introduced herself as Sergeant Ruth McAllister and told us, in careful Italian, that we would be processed and assigned. Those who volunteered for the Italian service units would receive script pay, decent quarters, and movie nights. The word volunteer sat awkwardly among guards and fences, yet her tone was matter-of-fact. After Italy's armistice, she explained, we were treated as co-belligerents against Germany. I knew enough from letters to believe it. Germany had become a shadow across our villages. Even pride learned to step aside. We filed through medical. A Navy doctor listened to my chest and clicked his tongue at the desert cough. They sprayed my uniform with powder, issued socks, and handed me a slip with numbers that now belonged to me. On the parade square, a training detail drilled. Their rifles spoke a different grammar, short, flat barks, and every 8th round dropped that metallic syllable, the ping that sounded like a minute ending. A harbor wind pushed the fog aside. The cranes kept swinging as if the day had no right to finish. A loudspeaker counted rail cars and destinations in an unhurried voice. A flat car rolled past, with 3 identical engines under tarps, the straps humming like bowstrings. I tried to picture the shop that made them and failed. The scale defeated imagination, and in that failure, I felt a clean edge of awe. This is how a nation wins, I thought, by turning the extraordinary into routine. Fog clung to the piers as if the harbor had decided to keep its secrets, and we followed the white stripe a corporal had chalked along the dockside, prisoners walking as carefully as dancers. A sign on a warehouse door read South Boston Army Base, in letters that looked carved rather than painted. They took our names again, then our temperatures, and sent us through showers that hissed like angry snakes. A clerk typed while chewing gum. Her hands moved faster than any staff sergeant's bark. We emerged powdered, shivering, and almost grateful. They issued us uniforms sewn to American patterns, but stenciled Italy on the sleeve. The cloth felt honest, like a promise to last. A woman in a tan shirt and skirt, garrison cap tilted just so, stepped onto a wooden crate. "Sergeant Ruth McAllister," she said in practiced Italian, "Women's Army Corps. You will be processed for the Italian service units if you volunteer." The word landed with the soft thud of a generous offer in a hard place. She explained that after the armistice we were co-belligerents. Those who signed would be paid in camp scrip, housed decently, and fed the same rations issued to American troops. I had watched men eat from grease-darkened mess kits on both sides of the Meredith line. Equal rations sounded like a rumor heaven would try. A captain with sandy hair, Harkins, took over. He described our likely jobs: unloading ships, maintaining depots, repairing rail cars. "It's honest work," he said, "and it moves the war where it needs to go." His voice had the warmth of a Midwestern kitchen and the authority of a schedule. Papers shuffled, fountain pens scratched. Men raised hands, hesitated, raised them again. I signed because the pen felt steadier than the world. We marched to a low cluster of barracks that smelled like pine and coal tar. Inside, bunks ran in neat geometry, and a pot-bellied stove ticked in the corner. The canteen served coffee, white bread, and something the cook called spaghetti, but that tasted more like memory wearing an American uniform. Still, it was hot and generous. A bulletin board announced nightly movies, chapel on Sundays, and rumor of weekend passes that would have to be earned. The guards looked bored rather than cruel. Their boredom was its own mercy. That first evening, McAllister walked the rows and corrected how we wore our garrison caps. She was kind without being soft. She told us that roughly 50,000 Italians were held in America, and that more than 45,000 had volunteered for ISUS. The number lifted a quiet murmur. In the desert, we measured survival by single digits. Now we were part of a column of tens of thousands. Harkins added figures like a priest reciting doctrine. Over 90 million man-days of labor predicted from Italian volunteers, more than $230 million saved to the Army, money turned into ships, shells, and shoes. He said it gently, almost apologetically, as if he knew the arithmetic had a human cost on both sides. Lights out came with the discipline of a train leaving on time. I lay awake listening to the barracks breathe and to the distant creak of cranes. Somewhere a radio hummed faint swing through blackout cloth. The day had shifted the ground under my thinking. Back home, production meant a cousin hammering in a garage, a foreman scowling at a missing gasket. Here, production was a tide table with the moon aligned to the hour. We had always believed culture would outlast machinery, but culture, I realized, had been melted down and cast into machinery that returned as culture again. Movies for prisoners, uniforms with our country's name, parish halls, offering dinners we had not earned. In the morning, we would begin work on the docks. A detail Harkins said was safe if you respect the lines and the hand signals. He spoke as if the war itself could be made safe by respecting lines. McAllister handed me a strip of script printed in a yellow so cheerful it felt like a dare. I bought a small bar of chocolate and cut it into squares the size of postage stamps, shared them down the bunk row, and watched eyes widen at sweetness. An American guard winked and said, Plenty more where that came from. He meant the canteen. The sentence meant a nation. I closed my eyes with the taste still on my tongue, and the impossible statistic in my head. The one they put in the newspaper, the one Harkins confirmed. The United States was producing almost 2/3 of all Allied war material. I had faced artillery batteries that felt like thunderstorms and tank squadrons that felt like avalanches. None of it frightened me as much as a fraction. 2/3. The number moved like a steel door on well-oiled hinges. Tomorrow the door would open, and I would see the room behind it. The boxcar doors fought their rails, then yielded, and cold iron breathed out of the dark like something newly alive. We stood back while an American crane eased its hook through the doorway and found the first lifting eye. The sling tightened and an engine rose into daylight, a Ford GAAV-8, block-painted battlefield green, manifolds shining like polished bone. The sergeant called for hands. We guided the load to the flat car's cribbing with palms out like priests. The weight hummed in our wrists before it settled, and the wood sighed. Harkins crouched by the engine and tapped its tag with a pencil. 1,100 cubic inches, he said. About 500 horsepower at speed. Tank heart. He looked up. Sherman. He did not need to explain the rest. We had seen the M4s where the desert changed color under their tracks. Here, the tank arrived in pieces a man could understand. He told us this one would go inland to a depot where parts lived briefly before they moved again, destined for Europe by ship and rail like pilgrims with stamped papers. We made a chain, sling, lift, guide, chalk, lash. Identical engines swung into place, and identical numbers stacked in Harkins's notebook. The work was hard, but not frantic. The equipment did the sweating for us. Winches with a steady growl, cranes that rotated like patient planets. A civilian foreman, a Union man by the look of his cap, called signals with a cotton glove. The glove told a story. Stop, lower, ease, hold. I could read it as I might read a liturgy. We ate at the dockside galley, steam fogging the windows. McAllister joined us with her mess tray and a small sheaf of forms. She asked our hometowns as if she might map them later on a wall. When she said the word standardization, it felt like a key inserted and turned. She described the M4 line, welded and cast hulls, 75 or 76 millimeter guns depending on the variant, crew of 5, radios calibrated to talk to everything that mattered. Around 50,000 built already, she added, almost casually, and the spoon paused halfway to my mouth. 50,000 was not a number. It was weather. After lunch, we moved to a siding where boxcars waited with stenciled destinies. An inspector taught us to chalk codes on the sides, unit, destination, date, so cargo could be found in a universe that refused to lose anything for long. He said his brother worked a production line that turned out a truck every couple of minutes. I believed him because belief had become simpler than doubt. The code for the truck tires, 40 by 8, felt like a prayer you could trust to land in the right ear. I caught sight of an M1 Garand in the crook of a sentry's arm and could not help studying it again. Its lines were graceful but without vanity. 8 rounds in an en-bloc clip .30-06 semi-automatic. The phrases had become familiar and still strange, like learning a foreign hymn and finding it fits your breath better than the one you were born to sing. A GI let me shoulder the rifle under supervision. The action moved with a silked precision my Carcano never promised. The empty clip leapt free and rang on the platform, and the sound turned heads because it meant readiness continued, rather than ceased. Afternoon light cut the fog into rectangles. We loaded crates of radios whose faces wore more dials than I had names for. SCR sets, Harkins said. Radios that want to be everywhere at once. He mentioned the doctrine that paired equipment with doctrine as if they had been married by a stern chaplain. Tanks with infantry, infantry with artillery, all of it talking. The talk, he said, might be the sharpest weapon. You could feel the truth of it in the dock's quiet grace. Machines and people conversing in gestures that did not require shouting. Toward dusk, a flat car rolled past with 3 turret rings under canvas. The sight made me think of cathedrals, circular, enormous, built to hold something that would outlast the men who built it. We lashed the last engine and signed the manifest. The foreman clapped his glove and said, "Good work, boys," and I swallowed the sting at being called that by a stranger and felt a guilty warmth at belonging to his we. We were dismissed into a harbor evening that smelled of rope and cold iron. McAllister handed out movie tickets with a grin that forgave our stiffness and our foreignness. On the walk back to barracks, I counted engines without meaning to, 1, 2, 3, and lost my place at 20 because another flat car rattled by with more of the same. That was the lesson the day set in my bones. Sameness as mercy, sameness as power. In Tunisia, we prized the clever fix, the made-do repair. Here, the fix had been made before the need existed, and 50,000 solutions waited on rails for problems they had already learned by heart. The parade ground smelled of cut grass and hot canvas, and the morning light made every metal edge too sharp to look at. A training detail trotted past, boots thudding in a square rhythm, rifles at the ready. Then the sound came, the crisp report of aimed fire, followed by the bright ringing ping of an empty clip leaping free. It was not a single noise so much as a signature. An American sergeant saw us watching and crooked a finger. "You can look," he said, "you just can't touch unless I say." He laid the rifle across his palms like an altarpiece. "U.S. rifle, caliber .30, M1, he said, and let the formal name hang. He stripped the action slowly for our benefit, thumb resting just so to avoid the bite every recruit learns once. He thumbed 8 rounds into the end-block clip, pressed, and the bolt snatched the first cartridge forward. We flinched at the suddenness. He smiled as if he had seen that flinch 1,000 times. "Semi-automatic," he added. "You work the trigger, not the bolt." The idea felt like a new grammar. Subject, verb, no conjugation. He handed the rifle to a private who fired at silhouettes while we watched the cadence. Aim, break, recover, aim again. No lifting the bolt, no searching for a rhythm between shots. The range coach called corrections, and the private fed accuracy with speed that our squads had never managed on good days. I tried to remember the precise feel of my Carcano's bolt, the scrape, the throw, the return, and realized that memory was already a museum. The sergeant quoted figures with the same calm he used for safety. .30-06 cartridge, 8 rounds per clip, practical 40 to 50 shots per minute if you know your sight picture and breath. The numbers were not decoration. They were an argument I could hear and see. A GI with a spare rifle let me shoulder it under his hand. The stock settled into the pocket of my shoulder as if it had been measured for me. I pressed the trigger without a round chambered and felt the clean break. No mud in the pull. The weight sat near 9.5 pounds, heavy but honest. A faint oiled smell worked up from the handguards, and the sights, aperture and front blade, aligned like a decision you had already made. I had handled fine rifles before. This felt like a fine rifle owned by an entire nation. Ruth McAllister showed up on the range with a clipboard and a grin that said the day was going well. She spoke to the training NCO and then to us, translating where needed. "The trick isn't just the rifle," she said. "It's the fact that every infantryman has the same one, maintained by the same manuals, fed by the same ammunition, taught the same drills." She did not have to add what followed. Sameness is speed, and speed wins. Harkins, arriving late with a stack of forms, nodded toward the ammunition shed. "We deliver the lesson by the truckload," he said. "Standard loads, standard routes, standard days." The enemy can't plan against that many certainties. We ate lunch under a canvas awning. A corporal set the M1 down and let us ask questions. "Where's the catch?" someone said. The corporal shrugged. "Catch is carrying enough ammo," he said, "but that's our business." He meant the quartermasters, the ordnance depots, the trains whose timetables never seemed to crack. Ruth told us that by war's end, millions of these rifles would be in service. An armory where the smallest unit was the individual and the standard was automatic compliance with the trigger. An army's muscle memory, precise and national. After noon, we watched a demonstration of clearing malfunctions. The drill counted seconds, tap, rack, reassess. Even the corrections were standardized. I thought of Tunisia, of men slapping bolts with dirty hands, of jammed chargers and shouted curses, of skill that could not be taught fast enough to matter. Here, the solution came printed, posted, drilled. It was not genius, it was decision, made once, and distributed everywhere. The day ended with the range gonging faintly as targets were reeled in and pasted. I walked back along the pier past crates stenciled with the same careful letters that lived on our sleeves. The Garan's ping still rang in my ears, a bell that did not toll an ending so much as announce a continuation. The next round chambered, the next shot already prepared. Civilization, I thought, had chosen to express itself in seconds, saved and motions removed. When the wind shifted, I smelled creosote, and the harbor, and the powder tang from the butt cans where spent cartridges waited for the salvage truck, and I understood that this was not an exceptional morning. It was ordinary, and that was the miracle. The letter from Enzo came folded like a small wound and smelled faintly of dust. The censor's stamp sat tidily in the corner, as if pain had a clerk. He wrote from Lombardy, where mule carts chewed ruts into frozen roads, and bread shrank until the ration card became a kind of prayer. He said the mill had stopped twice in a week for lack of power, and that Giovanna's boy had learned the sound of Allied bombers by heartbeat. "We keep our heads down," he wrote, "and we count. The numbers do not add up." I read it on a bench outside the barracks while a truck reversed with the polite whine of a well-oiled gear. The contrast felt indecent. Our camp served the same rations the guards received: meat that flaked into gravy, fresh milk on Sundays, coffee as black as a harbor at night. McAllister arranged a parish hall supper on Saturdays where men from the neighborhood pressed us to eat more and asked for Sicilian songs their grandparents had carried across. The priest blessed us in Italian without translating for his flock. In that room, the war felt like a snow globe someone else had shaken. I wrote Enzo back with careful honesty. I said we were prisoners but not starved, watched but not hunted. I described the docks, engines lifted with gestures half theatrical, half sacred, radios nested in crates like sleeping birds, tires tall as children rolled toward rails that would bear them to ports with names fit for postcards. I added what I had learned to treat like a liturgy: the M4's 5-man crew and 75mm gun, the Garan's 8-round clip, the Liberty ship's welded seams and record launch measured in days, not months. I wrote it all without boasting, as a man might describe a distant mountain to someone who had only ever seen hills. Ruth intercepted me at the canteen and asked gently whether letters home should carry certain details. She was right. The line between sharing and burdening is thin. I told her about the ration cards in Lombardy and the mill's silence. She nodded and said our camp could collect soap and send it through the Red Cross. Harkins overheard and made a note. He made many notes. The miracle was that he seemed to keep them all. At night, the barracks screened films, newsreels of convoys and factories, comedies where men in oversized shoes tripped into grace. The projector's beam looked like a bridge we could cross without permission. After lights out, I lay awake hearing the cranes complain and the sea tap at the pilings, and I turned over the number that unsettled me more than any shell fire ever had. It was not a casualty count or a map line. It was a fraction repeated in newspapers and in Harkins's briefings. The United States was supplying almost 2/3 of all Allied materiel. 2/3. I whispered it in Italian and in English and found it terrifying in both. Reports we heard from other camps confirmed the same gentle excess. Prisoners fed well enough to keep their strength. Birthdays remembered with cakes if the cook was sentimental. Milk allocated as if dignity were part of the ration. We had been taught to expect hardness from enemies and frugality from allies. Instead, abundance arrived methodically, with receipts. The effect on men like me was not simple gratitude. It was recalibration. Scarcity had organized our minds. Now plenty drew new lines. Enzo's next letter was shorter and older, delayed by a tangle of stamps. He asked whether America was as large as rumors claimed, and whether, if the war turned, a man like him could find honest work in a foundry. I told him yes without apology. I told him that work here wore overalls and a watch, that schedules ran with the authority of Scripture, and that a single shipyard could launch vessels faster than memory could pin the dates. I did not tell him that I had begun to feel embarrassed for the Axis, not for our courage, which had been sincere, but for our faith in an economy that had never been trained to sprint. When I sealed the envelope, the canteen radio hummed a tune I did not know. Outside, a guard practiced dry firing his M1, the trigger snapping like the click of a good decision. Somewhere a typewriter struck a bell at the end of a line, and I thought of all the bells this country could ring at once and still be understood. I picked up my cap and went to evening roll call, with the taste of tinned peaches still sweet at the back of my mouth. Morning came smelling of river mud and paint, and the shipyard yard boss wore his canvas cap like a crown he had earned with splinters. He pointed with a pencil, and the whole scene obeyed. Yarders, fitters, riggers, welders under leathers that flashed star-bright when arcs struck. The skeleton of a Liberty ship stood on blocks, its plates chalked with ciphers that looked like the shorthand of a new religion. A boy not old enough to shave ran bead after bead along a seam while an older man followed, chipping slag with the delicacy of a luthier. Ruth had wrangled us a day's tour because she believed sight could settle arguments that words only wounded. The foreman walked us along the ways and talked time as if it were steel. Prefabrication, he said, sections built in shops, rolled out on rail, swung by crane into place, stitch, test, move. He did not boast, yet the numbers rolled like surf. Median builds around 40 days in 43, faster when the gods of supply smiled. Someone mentioned the record at Richmond, California, a ship in 4 days and 15.5 hours. The foreman only raised an eyebrow. Good weather, he said, as if weather could explain miracles. We watched plates kiss and welders seal the marriage. Riggers sang to each other in a language made of gesture and impatient grace. A yard guide rattled off dimensions: 441 feet long, 10,000 tons dead weight, hold squared to swallow anything war asked for. She's a box with an engine, he said affectionately, and that's the point. Beautiful ships take time. Useful ones take a plan. America, I understood, had chosen to be useful with a beauty all its own. Harkins, who knew how to translate machinery into consequences, leaned on a stanchion and sketched the convoy picture in a few strokes. Escorts, air cover near shore, zigzags, blackouts, coated lamps. The sea is a road if you can keep repairing the road while you drive, he said. Liberty ships make repairs to the world. He pointed at a ledger that tracked hull numbers like birthdays. The pages turned and never seemed to thin. In the yard office, a wall map stuck with colored pins showed hulls by stage. The clerk moved one pin 3 inches and smiled. Launch tomorrow, he said. The certainty in his voice was the marvel. On another board, chalk tallied rivets, rod, electrodes, man-hours. The arithmetic looked like prayer and worked better. At lunch, we sat on sawhorses with stew in tin bowls. The steam carried pepper and a promise. A welder explained how welding had beaten rivets for speed and weight. A rigger explained how the crane crews learned each other's habits until movements compressed into instinct. "You shave a minute here, 10 there," he said, "and one day you wake with a ship nobody thought possible." He winked at me and added, "You do that enough times, you wake with an ocean." I tasted the sentence for truth and found it salted through. In the afternoon, a hull slid, slow and then sudden, catching the water like a hand finding a glove. Sirens bawled. A bottle broke. Men whooped without ceremony. The ship took the harbor's weight and answered with a small, satisfied roll, already impatient to be loaded, routed, guarded, dispatched. I felt an ache I could not name, something like homesickness for a place I had never lived, or loyalty to a method that had not raised me and now adopted me without conditions. On the way out, we passed a scrap pile where practice welds and misformed plate waited to be melted and tried again. Waste here was not failure, it was capital in a different tense. Ruth caught me staring and said, "We throw away more than some armies start with." She regretted the sentence as soon as she heard it, but it was only harsh because it was true, and truth has its own sound. Dusk made the cranes into black calligraphy against a brass sky. The foreman shook our hands as if we had helped, then shouted at a timekeeper for misplacing a chalk. Work resumed as if a launch were an interruption rather than a climax. We walked back through a town that wore its fatigue like a flag, and I turned the day into one line I could carry. A schedule is a weapon if you can keep it. Tomorrow we would be back on the docks, and I knew the rails would be crowded with proof. The newspaper lay on the canteen counter beside a plate of donuts dusted white as snow. The headline felt taller than the page. Arsenal output surges. U.S. provides lion's share of Allied supplies. Harkins set his coffee down and tapped a column with 2 fingers, the way a chaplain might touch a verse. "You can read this a dozen times," he said, "and it still won't fit in your head." The figures marched. Hundreds of thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of tanks, oceans of trucks, ammunition counted in the tens of billions. I felt the floor under the numbers and knew it was concrete. We carried the paper to the pier and let the day test it. A train chunked past, shouldering flat cars loaded with identical crates. A stevedore marked each with stencil and code, never pausing to admire his own accuracy. Another crew wheeled pallets of .30-06 in wooden boxes, the stencils clean as commandments. Ruth, arriving with a pencil behind her ear, folded the paper and recited from memory. Nearly 2/3 of Allied material furnished by these United States. She said it without triumph. She said it like a weather report you plan around. I tried to translate the fraction into pictures that would behave. 2 out of every 3 helmets, bayonets, radios, field kitchens. 2 out of every 3 chances a soldier has of eating warm or moving under armor or speaking across a mile. Tunisia rearranged itself in memory, artillery arriving like weather, rations arriving like mercy, fuel arriving not at all. I understood it backward. We had not been unlucky. We had been outnumbered by factories, outmaneuvered by schedules, outfought by a decision made at drafting tables and kitchen tables years before we realized there was a vote. A depot officer led us through aisles that smelled of cosmoline and pine. He explained lot numbers and inspection stamps, how a rejected batch found a bin with its own destiny, how nothing wandered far without a paper trail. He showed us a board where shipping priorities changed with the front's appetite. "You feed an army like you feed a furnace," he said. "Even when the fire looks steady, you're half an hour from dark." He ran a fingertip along a schedule and smiled when it came away clean with chalk. We spent the afternoon loading field ranges, steel stoves built to swallow wood, coal, imagination. An older GI told stories about hard winters when hot soup kept companies on their feet. "You think rifles win a war," he said. "You're right. You think soup doesn't, you're wrong." He introduced us to the vernacular of abundance. Spare, reserve, overage. Words that had never belonged to us began to fit our mouths. Toward evening, I found a quiet place by the rail and let the city speak. Whistles trading distances, gulls arguing over fish heads, a tug's engine talking in square syllables. The numbers from the paper ran again. 300,000 aircraft, 90,000 tanks, 20,000 ships, numbers that refused intimacy and yet touched every dock plank under my boots. If a country could do that while laughing at the movies and drinking coffee strong enough to polish a spoon, what else could it decide? Ruth joined me and said her brother wrote from an air depot where engines came in rows that looked like seed catalogs. "He says you can stand on a catwalk and feel the country breathing," she said. "Inhales parts, exhales airplanes." She tucked the newspaper under her arm and added, "This isn't about bragging. It's about finishing." The sentence sounded like doctrine and comfort together. We walked back along the water as lights came on in their careful blackout patterns. Somewhere a band was rehearsing for a VE Day parade none of us dared schedule. I thought of Enzo and his ration cards and the mill's silence, of men in every uniform who had fought bravely within smaller systems. I felt the peculiar humility that comes when size itself becomes a kind of virtue. The headline's fraction remained too large to hold, but the day translated it into steel and motion and bread. When the whistle blew for shift change, the harbor answered like a choir that knew every verse and intended to sing them all. The parish hall smelled of floor wax and tomato sauce, and the pew-worn hands that ladled supper had the efficiency of any good quartermaster. Long tables trembled with generosity, roast beef swimming in gravy, celery that snapped like new rope, loaves warm enough to steam the knife. A brass crucifix watched over the line as if to sanctify the arithmetic. Children, hair slicked for Sunday, stared at our uniforms and then at our sleeves where Italy announced itself without apology. An old man pressed a chair at me and said, in careful Italian learned from his father, "Mangia, your family tonight." We would have eaten anywhere. We ate here as if we were being measured for a future. Ruth moved through the room with a clipboard tucked under her arm, chatting with the parish ladies about sugar stamps and with Harkins about a shipment delayed by a siding tie-up. He had a way of making logistics sound like weather, inevitable, patient, mostly manageable if you looked to windward. A veteran at the coffee urn asked what gun I had served. When I said a 75, he nodded and told me his son had loaded a 105 in North Africa until the barrels wore thin. "The trick," he said, "is never letting the big fire go cold." After the plates were cleared, someone brought out a guitar with a crack in its back and asked for a song. We sang a Sicilian lullaby too soft for war, and the whole hall hushed as if a convoy were passing. Then the children demanded a trade, and a teenage boy stood and sang a tune from the radio, words about trains and promises. I understood only the chorus, but it landed clean. In that exchange, I could feel two worlds checking each other's pulse and finding a common rhythm. When we were done, the ladies sent us away with paper sacks heavy enough to scandalize a ration book. Apples, cookies, a wedge of cheese so sharp it cut memory into smaller, kinder pieces. Back at the docks the next morning, we unloaded field ranges and sacks of flour, war's other artillery. A cook with forearms like hawsers showed me how a stove that looked like a squat cannon could serve a company in a storm. "Hot food keeps squads upright," he said. "You don't let a rifle rust. You don't let a belly go empty." He had a doctrine's certainty. Around us, supply moved like a procession that refused to stumble. Crates of .30-06 logged and stacked, SCR radios checked against manifests, truck tires, 40 by 8, rolled toward freight cars with white chalk dates marching across their sidewalls. The impossible statistic announced itself not as a number on paper, but as a room that filled and refilled without strain. Harkins, coaxed by Ruth to speak plainly, laid it out over lunch. Italian service units across the country had already put in upward of 90 million man-days of labor. The Army's accountants reckoned more than $230 million saved because men like us stacked, lashed, repaired, inventoried. He said it with a quiet that stripped the boast from the miracle. Where I came from, a single shop counted heroic if it stayed open through winter. Here, prisoner hours became ships turning sooner, depots clearing faster, men at the front eating hot instead of cold. A nation had found a way to make even its captives into momentum. That afternoon, the camp screened a comedy, the kind where a man in oversized shoes turns falling into flight. The projector hummed a comforting mosquito in the dark. I thought of Enzo, of ration cards folding like little funerals in kitchen drawers. I thought of the parish hall's light, how it had found every sharpened cheekbone and softened it, and I understood, though I would never say it aloud, that this too was a weapon, abundance deployed without cruelty, generosity disciplined by lists and clipboards. We had expected an enemy's hardness. We found a rival for our poverty. When the lights came up, Ruth passed through the aisles reminding us about Sunday passes, earned, not given, and a collection for the Red Cross parcel program. We filed out to the barracks in a drizzle that smelled of rope and coal smoke. From the docks, a late crane called to its mate, steel on steel, a sound I now recognized as nearly liturgical. I lay awake and replayed the parish line, the joke at the dessert tray, the guitar's cracked body resonating like a well-used hull, the old man's hand on my shoulder. And I realized that for once the Axis had nothing equal to trade. America could afford kindness at scale. It was logistics, too. Spring arrived as a soft argument in Boston, more light between shifts, fewer white caps biting at the pilings, and the barracks radio began each morning with the front moving west. We stacked engines and counted crates while names crossed the air like distant thunder. Remagen, the Ruhr, encirclements that sounded less like maneuvers and more like closures. Harkins compared it to railroading a yard at full load. Line up the switches early, keep the crews fed, let momentum obey math. He didn't talk about heroics unless pressed. He talked about sequences, and the sequences were closing. One evening we crowded the day room while the set crackled with a voice reading bulletins in the stilted rhythm of a man outrunning his own pen. Reports, he always said reports, as if he were still sheltering doubt, spoke of fuel-starved columns, of aircraft grounded for want of trained men and repair parts, of an army cannibalizing itself to keep moving. They'd have some reserve left if they had the oil, an ordnance corporal muttered. But a tank without gas is just a rumor. No one in the room had to be told what that meant. We had all pushed rumors across sand. Ruth arrived with a ledger of Red Cross parcels and asked if anyone had news from home, then softened as a handful of us raised envelopes stamped weeks earlier. She had a way of making bureaucracy feel like rescue. After the meeting, she stood beside me by the open window and let the raw March air fill the silence. "We'll get the formal word when it comes," she said. But listen to the facts inside the reports. Facts had been her liturgy before they became mine. On the pier the next day, we loaded crates of spare barrels and recoil mechanisms bound for depots that would not see war another year. A GI instructor from the range smoked and watched the cranes. "You know what won this?" he asked, not expecting an answer. Time. We saved seconds at the bench, minutes at the dock, hours on the line, and the enemy never found a way to steal them back. He flicked ash into the wind and grinned without joy. "Don't tell the generals. It ruins the speeches." Toward April, rumors of Berlin's encirclement hardened into maps in the newspapers. black arrows curling like cables being coiled for storage. Enzo's last letter came thin and late. He wrote of sirens, of a mill restarted and stopped again, of a boy who counted airplanes by sound the way shepherds count sheep by silhouettes. He said the priests were busy because the arithmetic of grief never balanced, and asked whether America would need hands when this ended. I wrote back that in the shipyards every hand found a lever to pull, that a schedule loved a man who loved it back, that honest bodies would be welcomed by honest work. One night the radio sharpened without warning. The announcer did not sound triumphant. He sounded relieved, like a man lowering a beam on a sawhorse without crushing his toes. The German capitulation was near enough to touch, details to follow, official statements pending. We stood very still while the tubes glowed like coals, then exhaled as if a hatch had opened. No one cheered. A long war teaches caution even when the math finally favors you. Harkins told us the next morning that our tasks did not end with a broadcast. The machines still moved. Ships still wanted their bellies filled. Finishing is work, he said. Ruth added that mercy had its own logistics. Repatriation, relief shipments, rail lines restored where bridges had become sketches. Her words straightened men who had sagged in the doorway. Purpose lifts like any good hook. We ended shift staring across a harbor that had decided to behave itself. A tug nosed a Liberty ship off the berth, and the ship answered with a bass horn that rolled against our ribs. I thought of the first time I'd heard that voice, the feeling that something too big to be named had turned in its sleep. Now it turned to settle, and the water calmed around it. Tomorrow, Harkins said, the work would look the same. Chalk, lash, sign. But the world would weigh differently when set on the scale. May 8th rose with fog that thinned like paper under a hot iron, and by noon, the city had decided to be clear. At the South Boston Army base, men pretended to keep working while the radio kept repeating a sentence no one wanted to miss. Victory in Europe. The words rolled in a careful cadence, as if they could bruise. Somewhere downtown, church bells rang without waiting for an order. On the piers, whistles answered, then ship horns, then everything with a voice joined, a chorus made of machinery and faith. Harkins climbed a bollard and waved for quiet he did not get. He didn't try again. He just smiled in the way a man smiles when the last figure balances and the ledger closes without trickery. Ruth unpinned her garrison cap and let the breeze have at her hair, then shook our hands as if we were shipping out to a place she wished us well to see. An American flag went up on a makeshift pole. A tricolor appeared beside it, borrowed from a parish hall and creased from decades. The two cloths snapped above the same pier without jealousy. Work resumed in the way of honest people who understand that stopping is a luxury best saved for sleep. We winched field kitchens onto flat cars, stacked crates of medical supplies that would sail east labeled relief instead of priority, and signed manifests with hands that trembled less than expected. Men who had learned the taste of fear found themselves unsure how to chew joy. A GI from the range brought out a stack of bunting and a tin of thumbtacks. Within an hour, the warehouse fronts looked like parade floats, and we were embarrassed by how quickly celebration could be standard too. The camp opened its gates for a 2-day pass rotation. We poured into a city that had cleverly saved paper for this day alone. Confetti fell like reports filed and final. On Tremont Street, a sailor kissed a girl under a fire escape while a cop looked away with professional timing. A streetcar operator wore a carnation over his uniform and ran on schedule out of respect, as if punctuality were his gift to the occasion. In the North End, old women wept and fed strangers with the same spoon. A union hall rolled a piano onto the sidewalk. Someone banged out "Be mir bist du schön," and then "Anchors Aweigh," and the crowd swayed between them without choosing sides. Ruth found me near the Common and pressed a program into my hand. names of men from the neighborhood carved into a parade's order. She said the ISUS would be thanked on the reviewing stand. I told her we had only moved boxes. She told me boxes win wars and left before I could argue. On the stand, a colonel read from a paper about cooperation and good conduct. The microphone made his consonants into little sparks. We stood at parade rest while the band tried to fold the entire war into 8 measures, and I felt the odd relaxation that comes when your body finally believes the map. Back on the pier at dusk, the fireworks that no one had admitted planning began in modest bursts. The harbor made each bloom into a second and third, light upside down and trembling. A Liberty ship sounded a long, satisfied note. Another answered in a lower key. The call and response made a hymn. Men lifted their faces as if rain had begun, and in the flicker I saw what the day had done to us. Fear had not left. It had been archived. That is a different thing. In the barracks, quiet fell fast. Harkins walked the aisles once, not checking, just counting by the old habit. Ruth stopped in the doorway and said simply, "Good work," the way she had said it 100 times in smaller rooms. I lay down with confetti stuck to my sleeve and thought of Enzo's letters, of mills that would turn again, of bridges that had become blueprints overnight. The horns still muttered to each other out on the dark water, and I believed for the first time that their language could be peace. The harbor settled into a post-war rhythm that sounded like patience, winches sighing under lighter loads, trains taking longer to fill, the docks humming at a volume that let a man hear his own breath. We still worked, because finishing is work. We packed relief, not rations, and loaded tools, where once we had stacked shells. A chaplain blessed a pallet of textbooks bound for a school in Normandy. The manifest clerk wrote the destination name slowly, as if handwriting itself could rebuild a town. I walked the pier before dawn and thought of how numbers had taught me their grammar. 50,000 M4 Shermans built in the years when the world leaned toward collapse. A rifle for nearly every GI, the M1's 8-round heartbeat making squads into metronomes. Liberty ships measured in days, a record launch in 4 days and 15.5 hours that still strained belief no matter how often Harkins said it plain. 300,000 aircraft that had turned air into architecture. Nearly 2/3 of all Allied material furnished by a country that kept eating breakfast and mending uniforms and sending boys to prom in the same season. The numbers had been the protagonists all along, patient and relentless, and I had been slow to recognize their faces. I tried to replay the moments that had made the arithmetic human, the parish hall where generosity arrived in ladles, the range where the Garand's ping turned seconds into doctrine, the shipyard where welding arcs lit up the choice to be useful instead of beautiful, and then made usefulness into beauty. If you had told me in Tunisia that abundance could teach as brutally as scarcity, I would have called it a joke in poor taste. Now I understood that an industrial democracy fights by making common things holy: standard loads, standard drills, coffee shared with the man who wears your enemy's name on his sleeve because a soldier's hunger is not politics. Enzo's last letter reached me with a Boston postmark. He had found work at a small foundry that sang like a well-kept engine, and he wrote that the owner kept a schedule on the wall like a catechism. He wanted to know whether ships still launched quickly now that peace had declared itself. I wrote that they did, when they should, and that a schedule kept in peace is a promise to the dead. I added, careful of the censors even in victory, that milk tasted different when it was no longer a statistic, and that a boy who counted airplanes by heartbeat would learn to count seasons again. Ruth came by with discharge papers to sign. She had a way of making endings feel like well-packed crates. Nothing rattled, nothing lost. Harkins shook my hand and then, because habit owns him, checked that his pencil was sharp. He told me there would be ships home for us soon, and ships for those who wanted to stay and make homes here. He did not advise. He trusted a system that had earned trusting. The dock smelled of rope and rain and a little of sawdust because someone was repairing a pallet instead of writing it off. War had taught waste to behave. I packed the few things that were mine again: a prayer card from the parish hall, a strip of camp script gone soft as cloth, a page torn from a newspaper with a headline that still leaned taller than the room. I would have liked to carry an M1's clean weight as proof that modernity could fit a shoulder, but proof was everywhere here, and I was learning to travel light. On my last walk down the pier, a crane turned and stopped dead on a painted mark with the calm of a practiced breath. That stillness was the war's truest monument. The tugboats called to each other in low voices, and a bell rang far out where fog made a wall that would lift by noon. I thought of all the minutes saved by hands I knew and faces I had only passed, seconds shaved by welders and clerks, hours banked by stevedores and cooks, days paid in man-hours no poet had learned to rhyme. The Axis had taught us to respect courage. America had taught me to revere order. The difference had been a gulf you could cross only on a bridge built of schedules. When my ship whistled and the gangway thudded into place, I paused and touched the rail. The metal was cold and honest. I said a prayer for the country that had captured me and then shown me the mathematics of mercy, and for my own country that would need those lessons more than it needed pride. The engine turned over, old as victory and new as the day. Somewhere, in a depot I would never see, a clerk's pencil ticked one more mark in the column called finished, and the harbor nodded, and the bell spoke again.